This first code here for our to-do element exists in this app component. There's nothing wrong with it, but not only do we have some static text here, we would of course want the actual to-do title here. Not only is that the case, if we would want to add a second to-do, we would have to replicate this entire code block. And if we then ever want to change anything about that, let's say we want to add extra span to that button, whatever, then we have to do this in all those places where we use the same code. That's not really what we want to do. That's why React embraces this concept of components, of building our own building blocks, which we then compose together. For this, I'll remove this duplicate code and instead create a new file. A new file in that src folder, which I'll name todo.js. The name is up to you. The extension should be .js though, and that will simply hold another component. We're going to build our second component here. Now, typically those component files, except for that so-called root component, this app component, are stored in a separate components folder, which I also added in the source folder. So I'll move todo.js into that folder. That's not a must do, but it is a convention to keep your project organized. Now in this todo.js file, I want to create my second component, that to-do component. And we did learn that a component in React is just a function. So in the end here, we define a function, to-do, and then we export that. We need to export it like this, with this syntax, to make this function available outside of this file and usable in other files. Now, one important note about this function name though, you can name your component functions however you want, but there is one important restriction, one important thing to keep in mind. The name of the function should start with a capital character. That matters because when we later use this function as a component in our HTML code, so if we use it as a custom HTML element, then it will have to start with a capital character there as well to differentiate it from the built-in HTML elements. React wants custom components to start with a capital character. So now we have our function here. And then here in this function, we must return something that can be rendered to turn this function into a component. And that something is this div here. This div with the class name card. I'll cut it from app.js and then return it here in todo.js and press that auto format shortcut again. So now that's our to-do function returning this JSX code. Back in app.js, we can now use this to-do component. And we don't do that by executing to-do like a function, as we would normally do that, but instead we use it as a custom HTML element, just as we did it with app in the index.js file. So here, where I cut the code from, I'll add to-do like this, as a HTML element. The only special thing here is that it's self-closing. Alternatively, we write an opening and closing tag. This would work as well. But since there will be no content between the tags, we can also write a self-closing tag. But then it has to have this /. It would not be allowed like this. Now, as noted before, it is worth pointing out here that this component, this custom element, when we're using it here in this JSX code, that there it has to start with a capital character. So to-do with a lowercase t at the beginning would not be valid, because React internally differentiates between built-in HTML elements like divs and h1 tags and custom elements by casing. All these built-in elements start with a lowercase character. Custom elements built by you or others have to start with an uppercase character. And that is just something to be aware of. Now, to use to-do in app.js, though, we need to import it from the todo.js file. And for this, at the top of this file, we import to-do from ./components to construct a relative path to that components folder to do. Again, the file extension of .js can be omitted here. That's now this to-do imported and rendered here. If we now save all files, we see the same output as before, which is good. That means that everything still works, but we're now getting to that output with help of our separate component. Now, if we want to have multiple to-dos, we just got to replicate this to-do component here in the app component, and we now have a couple of to-dos. And if we now ever want to change anything about that to-do component, about this HTML markup that makes up a to-do, we just need to do it in the to-do.js file, like adding this span, which has no real purpose but acts as a demo. And if we then save that file, we see that extra span in all our to-dos, because we define it once and then reuse it multiple times. Just as in vanilla JavaScript, we would define a function once and then possibly call it multiple times from different places in our application. It's the same concept here with React components. Though we don't need the span here, so I will get rid of that now. What we do need here, though, is some configurability. At the moment, all to-dos just say title. And that's not too useful. These should be different to-do titles for our different to-dos. And of course, I can change the title here to Learn React, but since I do this in this to-do.js file, this will now affect all to-do usages again. So all to-dos which we're outputting. So that's not how we make this more configurable. Instead, we want to let the place where we use the to-do, so the app component, pass different data into these to-do components, just as we pass arguments into functions when we call them, to then output different data in each to-do instance depending on which data we're passing in. And that's what we're going to do now.